Say what sound to me, and so I would move approval.
Okay. Second.
Do you have any comments, corrections on it? All those in favor? All right. Item 2. Actually, let me make one comment. I believe we may get Hassan to come in and do items number 4 and 5, director's report. When he does come in, I'm going to kind of take things out of order and have him give his presentation. So we may, you're next in line when he comes in. We might skip you and go straight to Hassan. Okay. Public comments. I don't have any speaker slips. Do I have any people? Anybody from the public wishing to comment? Or anybody on the committee? Or anybody? No? Okay. Item number 3. That's our Transit Environmental Mitigation Program. That's on consent. Does anybody have any reason to pull anything off? I did review it. I don't have any questions or concerns about it. I would move that we approve on consent.
No approval necessary.
No, I would take that back. All right, so we're skipping 4 and 5 until Hassan gets here. So item number 6 is Ariana.
Yes. I just have quick updates since your last meeting. Since your last meeting, the board approved a few items which were presented at your last meeting. They approved the Transplant short-term revenue estimates, the new environmental mitigation program memorandum of agreement, the RTCIP fee adjustment, which you saw at your last meeting, and then the regional plan action plan, which you heard about at your last meeting and you'll continue to receive updates on as well. And then the board also reviewed the Transplant program update that is on your agenda today. And then they also held their annual board retreat, and a couple of our ITOP members attended that as well.
Any questions? Oh, we're quiet. Item 7A, the Transit Fiscal and Compliance Audit Findings and Recommendations, and Lisa.
Give me a moment.
No problem.
Okay, ready. So the ordinance requires the ITOC to conduct an annual fiscal and compliance audit of Transnet recipients. So we're in the final stages, and the ITOC's auditor, Jennifer Barr to my left, is here to present results of the drafts. So there's an item A and B, and once Jennifer is done, then we'll come back to me to close out item A, and then we'll just roll right into item B. Okay, Jennifer?
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I have lots of great information to share with you, and I understand this is an interactive process, so interrupt me mid-sentence at will, and we can get into some details. So we have performed agreed upon procedures of 24 agencies, including 18 cities in San Diego County, also the County of San Diego, MTS, NCTD, SANDAG, Caltrans, and ITOT. Our field work was performed by our auditors between September of 2018 and December of 2018, and we have provided you the draft of the agreed upon procedures reports. There are 7 major areas of review that we looked at that I would like to go over in more detail. The first area is the testing of expenditures. In this testing, we selected 25% of the total expenditures for the year to determine if they were included in the RTIP and if they were for eligible cost. We reported to you that there were 2 agencies that are in the process of obtaining approval for inter-project transfers, and that approval will be obtained by the time we meet with you next time. Those are for the cities of Lemon Grove and the city of Oceanside. As part of our testing, we did identify some expenditures that we believed were improperly classified as congestion relief for the city of Lemon Grove. However, they had a similar project for maintenance, and so the city agreed to move the project cost from congestion relief to maintenance. If you recall, that's one of the procedures that was added this year, is to take a deeper look at what was considered congestion relief and what was considered maintenance. So overall, no issues with that other than that one agency. I did want to point out, since I'm new to this process, I had a lot of questions for Sandex staff about the schedules and how things are reported. And one thing that stood out to me was how unrealized gains and losses on investments are reported on Schedule A and Schedule B. I wanted to point out to you that there's a bit of a mixed bag going on between the agencies on how it's reported. So the unrealized gain and loss on investments is technically a component of investment income from an accounting standpoint. So some agencies you'll see on the schedule break it out separately at the bottom and call it a GASB 31 adjustment. So that's the change in market value of investments, basically. So some agencies will break it out separately. Some agencies have included that gain or loss on investments included in their interest income number, and some agencies don't include it at all on the schedule. And so I brought up to Sandex staff, why do we have inconsistencies? Should there be one way or another way of doing it? And I believe this committee has discussed it in the past, and maybe we're okay with the way it's presented, but I did want to at least point out to you that there are some inconsistencies, and there might be an opportunity to create consistencies in that reporting. Any thoughts on that before I move on?
Consistency is good.
I think the issue is, from my standpoint, unrealized gains and loss on investments is defined by the accounting standards as a component of investment income. It truly is, from an accounting standpoint, a part of investment income. The fact that it's separated out separately seems unusual to me. I would generally recommend that it be included as a component of investment income, but that would be a change in the future on how that is presented.
That's just something we would suggest that we do or include in the future reporting.
Yes. So in May, at your May meeting, the Fiscal and Compliance Audit Subcommittee is chosen, and then we start the discussions with that group on the agreed upon procedures for fiscal year 19. And so we would have the discussion with that group first and decide, how this could work, and probably reach out to some of the cities, the different jurisdictions, to see if there are any barriers one way or another, and then bring it back to the ITAC as a whole with the agreed upon procedures in July.
So moving on, I did also want to mention, this is more of a note for next year, something to consider next year. In my review of the agreed upon procedures, when we're testing 25% of the expenditures, you can imagine everything we're testing is construction contracts, a lot of external cost. But some of these agencies have some fairly significant internal cost, and primarily payroll charges. There was one agency where 42% of the total expenditures were payroll related. And yet the way that we've defined the procedures, we could easily never test a payroll expenditure because we're trying to get coverage of 25%. So testing a $100 transaction, you could understand why we might not want to test a lot of $100 transactions if we're trying to get coverage. So something to consider in May is if an agency has maybe over 5% of cost related to payroll or 10% of cost related to payroll, that there's possibly an additional step that we do look at the payroll charges to make sure that they're adequately supported by timesheets and personnel action forms. Although individually those costs are not significant, in total, those are significant costs, sometimes can be significant costs of the total expenditure. Sorry, I hadn't told you that.
Yeah, I'll write it down.
Good question.
Yeah, also just for clarity, could you speak to the, when you reference the 25% testing, if that 25% is, comprises 25% of total expenditures or 25% of the number of transactions?
It's 25% of total expenditures.
Right, which is why the problem or the risk, if you will, that you mentioned is an ongoing risk because you'll just never get to those kinds of expenditures.
Exactly.
Just a bookkeeping question, if you will. Page 7 or 12, whichever it is, of this handout, states at the very bottom, it summarizes the findings very nicely. And it says at the bottom, complete responses, etc., from the agencies are included in the individual recipient reports. Well, I only saw, I think, 3. Am I missing something, or have you, where are the others?
This is the summary, the executive summary to the entire audit, and then the entire audit is linked. It's about 500 pages, I think, but we have a reference copy here.
Okay, so we have received, no, I don't need to see them
Okay.
if they're satisfactory. I just wanted to make certain that they existed at this time. All right, thank you.
And so moving on to the next major area of review, which is the maintenance of effort testing. We compared the discretionary expenses reported on the state street reports to the maintenance of effort base year amount to determine if the local agency spent at least the maintenance of effort base. And we found that there were 2 agencies that were not in compliance with the requirement. That would be the city of San Marcos and the city of Del Mar. And again, if you look at their individual reports, you'll see the agency's response to those issues. This year, because every 3 years we recalculate the maintenance of effort, so this year there was an extra procedure to do that recalculation, and that would be to determine the new maintenance of effort requirement for fiscal year 2021 through 2023. The overall growth rate using a construction cost index was 1.33, but the agencies can use a different number depending on their the increase in general fund expenditures or general fund revenues for their agency. So they'll have a mixed bag of percentages, but the overall, one of the baselines was 1.33%. I did want to, so the new maintenance of effort requirements are included as a schedule in the summary report and also in each individual report. I did want to mention that the city of Del Mar and the city of Imperial Beach, we have yet to calculate their new maintenance of effort because their comprehensive annual financial report is not yet complete. We anticipate that they will be complete, and by the next time we meet with you, we will have those numbers, but I did want to point out that they're currently missing from the report. The next major area is the 30% SANDAG board policy rule, which determines whether agencies maintained a balance of no more than 30% of their annual apportionment. We found that all agencies were in compliance with that requirement with the exception of the city of Coronado. And in that situation, the city of Coronado will not receive additional funding until they're in compliance with that 30% apportionment rule. The next,
Maybe before we leave that, and it's actually a bit of a digression, but maybe for you guys, is the 70-30 rule still being discussed by the board for potential updating, or has that gotten kind of sidetracked with the Hassan's request to do a whole new regional plan?
You're talking about the 70-30 rule regarding
Performance audit recommendation.
yeah, the congestion relief versus maintenance. Yeah, so it's not so much that the board is still reviewing, it's staff is still working internally to develop options.
Got it. Thanks.
That's a great segue onto the next topic, which is the 70-30%.
It's the other 70.
That's the other 70.
So related to that, we are testing to ensure that at least 70% of revenues provided for local street and road purposes were used for congestion relief, and no more than 30% were used for maintenance. And we had no exceptions with any of the agencies with that testing. And then on a cumulative basis, we're checking to see if that 30% of maintenance has been exceeded as well, from the beginning of time, from a cumulative standpoint. And there were no agencies that were above 30%, but there were 3 agencies that are getting very close to keep your eye on. One of them is the city of Lemon Grove at about a little over 28%, the city of Poway at 29%. It's actually 29.72, so they're getting very close. And the city of San Diego at 29.14%. One thing that I wanted to mention to you when it comes to this 70-30% calculation is another inconsistency that we noted between the agencies. It's kind of a technical issue, but if you recall, some agencies have debt service payments recorded in their schedules, and at least one agency does not have debt service repayments in their schedule, although they do participate in a similar program. And I wanted to point out that for the purposes of calculating this 70%, 30%, the fact that you have different agencies handling the way the debt service payments are recorded on the schedules does have an impact on this calculation. So we recalculated it, as if everyone were handling it the same way by reporting the debt service on there, and we recalculated it if everyone was handling it the same way by not reporting debt service as part of this calculation. Either way, there's still no instances of non-compliance, but it's one of those things as an auditor, if we have this baseline where you're trying to compare agencies, it seems like it would be a good plan to try to find a way that everyone is being measured in the same way. So whether that's removing that debt service payment from the calculation or making all agencies report it is maybe something we can discuss at a future meeting. So moving on to the Regional Transportation Congestion Improvement Program procedures that we performed. We are, in this testing, we're ensuring that the agencies collected the approved exaction fee and that they tracked the fee properly and spent the fee revenue on approved projects. We noted 2 exceptions where the city of Imperial Beach and the city of National City did not collect the correct exaction fee, and those are reported as well in terms of how they're planning to remedy that situation. And I believe in both cases they're planning to go back to the entities that paid the fee to collect those fees. In both cases, they were obviously under what those fees were. With the Regional Transportation Congestion Improvement Program, we select 10% of total expenditures to ensure that the eligible project costs are incurred with these funds. We had almost no exceptions. We did have one exception for the city of Imperial Beach. It had $24 of costs that were not eligible, and we've noted that in the report, and they provided a management response for that as well.
Yeah, going back to the exaction fees, were those cases of just, oops, sometimes somebody makes a mistake, or in your view, is that an indication that there might be broader control issues?
I believe in both cases they were using the prior year exaction fee, so they just possibly hadn't updated their fee schedule for the change. So no, not just one-off errors. I did want to point out, and one of the questions that I had being new to this process that seemed a little odd to me is, I understand that the the revenue has to be spent within 7 years. However, there's a little bit of a loophole with that. If you commit the funds to a project, you can have it for longer than 7 years. But that process of committing them doesn't seem to have any limits to it. You know, you could say that I'm committing a project, and 20 years down the line, you could have not spent that money. And more particularly, there were situations where Transnet funding was being provided for the same exact project instead of organizations using their available resources. So it could have been, I think in multiple situations, it was the exact same project that was committed, where they were not using their existing resources. Instead, they were requesting funding through the regular Transnet program. So maybe something we can address in the future as well, of whether or not there needs to be some sort of limit on committing those funds, or you have to use these funds first before you can request draw down on these other funds if it's the same project.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. When you say they're committing funds, are they committing transit funds, or what funds are they committing? It doesn't have the...
Right, so the ordinance uses the language committing the funds, and what that means is that they have to be programmed. So they'll say, I have, $100,000 of RTCIP collected, and I'm almost at that 7-year mark, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the RTIP under, this project number. But then they also may have Transnet, their street and road, their LSI on the same project, and they're not, instead of them using the RTCIP revenue that they've collected for that project, they're just using their Transnet, and they keep requesting their drawdown on their Transnet for those expenditures instead of applying them to this other bucket that they have.
In the recommendation, we can put some sort of time frame on that for them to spend those funds, or not double commit, or...
Well, I mean, having multiple sources, revenue sources for one project it's pretty normal, so that's okay. It's just, having choosing which ones to use first could possibly be, if you programmed your RTCIP, you should use that before you use your LSI, something along those lines.
Is there guidelines for that?
We don't have that, and that's what the suggestion is, perhaps that we go that step further and suggest that, the board policy perhaps.
I was going to ask, so that would have to be an action by the board, presumably?
I believe so, probably in the RTCIP section of our board policy 31.
Because we've talked about that issue, I think, in the past when Jonathan's raised the city of San Diego, and particularly having that ongoing balance that they finally started to spend down. But it seems, loophole seems like a good word. Maybe if we could make that a fuss item.
So moving on, we also tested the RTCIP for allowable expenditures for administration cost. And in most cases, we didn't see any administration costs being charged to this program. But for one city, the city of Oceanside, we calculated that 3.69% was spent for fund administration. And we discussed it with the city, and they agreed to reduce the project expenditures to get it down to the 3%. It was interesting to see this 3%. I know it's part of the policy. However, on the Transnet side, you don't have that 3% limit. You could kind of see it. It's synonymous with indirect cost. So you've got a 3% indirect cost limit on RTCIP, no indirect cost limit on regular Transnet funding. Right? That's the way I read it. It seemed a little restrictive, but still only one agency that had an issue with it. We also evaluated whether or not any cities have granted developer credits in lieu of collecting the exaction fee. And we are still looking into the city of San Diego as part of their calculation. There are developer credits, and I think we need some further analysis before we report back to you on that. And all agencies did provide their RTCIP information for our review by December 1st, which is a requirement. Now moving on to transit operator eligibility. As part of our testing, we ensured that over prior year, the total operating cost per vehicle hour for bus and revenue vehicle mile for rail service did not increase greater than the increase in CPI. The CPI increase was 5.95%. Both MTS and NCTD were not in compliance with the rail operator eligibility. The MTS's increase was 7.61%, and NCTD's increase was 8.45%. And I believe that this topic will be discussed in a later agenda item. And lastly is our testing of indirect cost. Again, it's as you know, a very much mixed bag of what agencies charge indirect costs, which ones don't, and the manner in which they do it. There are 13 agencies allocated indirect cost. Of those agencies, the city of Coronado is the only one that did not do it last year, but they did this year. So last year you had 12 agencies, now you have 13. For those agencies, the indirect cost as a percentage of the total Transnet expenditures ranged from less than 1% on the low end, and on the high end, a little over 18%. In my professional judgment, that seems completely reasonable from an indirect cost standpoint. If you're looking at something at 40%, 50%, that's probably where my red flag would go up to see what's going on. There are 4 agencies that actually have an official indirect cost rate that's approved, in accordance with the federal standards and approved by their cognizant agency. Those ones you can feel pretty comfortable that they've been beat up. The other ones, when I looked at last year's report, there was some reporting that said they had a plan and it was approved. But when you really look at it, unless it's approved by a cognizant agency or otherwise audited by a professional CPA firm, it really is management's estimate of what indirect costs are. In some cases, city council approved it. In some cases, they didn't. In some cases, the consultant is used to calculate those costs. In some cases, it's just something that internal staff do. Nothing seems unreasonable in our testing of the methodology of how it's done. In most cases, it's based on actual direct labor. So a percentage, like a burden rate that is attached to direct labor, which seems completely reasonable and fair. I know this committee wants some sort of consistency with indirect cost. I'm not sure we're going to get there, but I did, willing to talk about it further. There is definitely a mixed bag of how it's done, and I didn't see anything that appeared to be egregious or unreasonable in any way.
So I had a question, well, 2 questions. One, just first of all, the presentation on attachment F. Are the NAs in some cases NAs because there were no indirect costs, but in other cases the NAs are NAs because they've been audited separately? So just to help me understand what the NAs.
Right, and if you look at last year, there'd be a lot less NAs. So when I looked at it, I only put the last approved plan approval if either a cognizant agency approved it or there was some sort of a formal approval process. So that could have been city council approving it. Everything else in my mind is just, it's just an estimate. I don't know who approved it, and so that way I just put NA.
So to make sure I'm understanding, so for example, in the case of Coronado, where they in fact do have indirect costs, there's an NA there because they just don't have a plan. Is that?
They have a plan. It's not particularly formal or approved by city council or otherwise audited.
Okay. Now, it's been a number of years that we've been talking about this, so I'm a little bit fuzzy as to where we ended up, but because it also was just noteworthy in the case of Chula Vista where their plan was 2010. Didn't we specify that there was a time period after which the agencies needed to update their plan, or do we come to the realization that we actually don't have the power to enforce that?
Yeah, we suggested to them that they update it. They actually were working on it, so I'm surprised that it didn't happen for the city of Chula Vista. But yes, we don't. Without a board policy, we don't have anything to enforce. So it's more of just making suggestions to them, talking and trying to figure out what their process is, and you know, if they would be willing to change it, how difficult that may be, if it would be, if they couldn't charge indirect to the Transplant, would that create a problem? Trying to work through all of that, and it's a mixed bag. Yeah. So it was just very difficult to try to define a rule that would be acceptable to the ITOC, to ensure that they are reasonable rates, if you will, but also that will eventually be approved by the board. So we had to try to marry those two, and so we were hoping that with Jennifer, and her team, kind of, digging into this a little bit more and looking at it, and to determine, is this what they're doing? Does it seem reasonable? And the rates that they're charging, and it does seem at this time, the fact that not all of them are going through a formal approval process. I mean, we could always reach out to them individually and see if they could go through that process, especially if it's going to council.
Has there ever been a recommendation to the board from ITOC on this?
We have not gotten to that point, because it was trying to define a rule, and it was that there's a lot of difficulty with that. We spent quite a bit of time on that, but when you're dealing with this many jurisdictions and the internal processes are very different between the different entities, it is hard to define a rule.
It seems a little too left open. I mean, if you look down here, how many, you don't know if they have a plan or a plan, and it just seems very wide open. But if you even just go to the lowest common denominator on all of them, to have something that would have some type of plan.
Well, it's not that they don't have a plan, is it?
Or some guideline. Maybe,
It's just
some
not city council.
policy.
Well, I think as we talked about this, and I may be the only person who's been on the committee for the number of years that we've been talking about it, but I think our bottom line was just wanting some sense of comfort as to reasonableness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so if as an auditor you can attest to reasonableness, in your own way that's not highly inefficient without a formal plan, I mean, that's really our bottom line. But it just, to Greg's point, it just does strike one that, if an entity is not otherwise being audited on this measure, the notion that there is transparency as to how the indirect costs are being allocated seems like just a fairly basic aspect of financial control. But again, I think, like I said, our bottom line is reasonableness. So in reviewing this, if you've concluded that nobody is an outlier vis-a-vis reasonableness, I think that's fine, at least from my point of view.
And so, I'm sorry, you said from what you saw, there's no issues or anything that cropped up.
Right. Nothing that we were concerned about where we felt that they were being overcharged. I could see asking them if they're going to charge indirect cost, to at least formalize their plan in writing and possibly have city council or their board approve it.
Because if I hear you right, there's no consistency on it.
No.
So how would you even come up with a reasonableness if there's no consistency? Because it seems to be wide open. So everything would be reasonable if that's the case.
Well, again, that's where I think if they're looking at this and it's not an undue burden for you to actually take a look at this, then we do have the comfort of those outside auditor eyes looking at it. But yeah, I mean, in theory, it seems like having at least transparency about this sort of thing is fairly basic. But at the same time, we all realize that these people are in the business. We want them to be in the business of building stuff, serving the taxpayer and not serving, just accounting for the sake of it. So if your work, Lisa, has concluded that it's too burdensome for some of these entities to, go as far as we'd like, then again, at least for me, I'm comfortable that if our auditors on an annual basis are going to look at it and come back to us if anything's unreasonable, that's better than not, but it's not ideal.
I have a question. Why do some agencies charge and some don't? Is there a rhyme or reason? I mean, I look down and, I don't know if it's the expenditures, I'm just kind of looking at the numbers, trying to correlate, and they don't correlate to how much people are charging compared to what their expenditures are. So it just seems random.
Mm-hmm. Most of the agencies that charge indirect costs, it's because they have internal staff costs that are also being charged to the project. In most cases, indirect costs is a product of direct labor costs. So if you have agencies that use construction companies to handle 100% of the transactions, they might not have even considered allocating indirect costs, although there's truly are indirect costs involved in administering those contracts. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. If you're administering anything, there's indirect costs. And so some are just deciding to eat the cost and not passing, so maybe we can convince them all to just not pass. And then we wouldn't have a problem.
Good, thanks.
So that was the last of the 7 main areas. And as mentioned, the results of all of our procedures and the details are in these great big books for you. And if there were any exceptions, there is a management response section. And our plan is to finalize these reports within 60 days after today's meeting, as per the ordinance requirement. So next time we meet, these reports should be final.
Okay. So.
Was that the end of 7A?
That's yes, then for 7.
Okay, if it's okay with you guys, just take a stop, and we have Kim and Hassan are here now. And
Can I close on this one?
Sure,
Do you guys
yeah.
want
Yeah, because we have a recommendation on
this?
this one.
On the
7A.
costs?
oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
But
on the.
but do you guys, does the ITOC want something specifically with this issue in their costs? Or you're comfortable with the auditors basically just checking it and seeing if it's reasonable?
Hearing what I'm hearing, from my perspective, I'm comfortable with it, and it doesn't sound like we'll get anything unless there's something that the board can do to direct some policy change. But I defer to.
Well, I think if what we're dealing with for the moment is the recommendation to accept this audit report, I'd move that we do so. We could perhaps have follow-up conversation about future audits as we, convene an audit committee to look at future audits. But I would move that we accept the.
I will second the motion. I had a simple question on item 7B, which we can discuss at that time.
B?
Yeah, well, we'll do it.
Yeah, so we'll wait, yeah.
We'll get into that
And
later.
I apologize, he said it.
No, it's okay.
So we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion or?
I guess just a comment, if I'm understanding right, if we have future discussion about this, but there's agencies willing to spend their money on actual projects and not use the money for staff. I'm perfectly happy with that. You know, I don't want to create a, I guess I would just caution that we don't create a process that requires them to start charging staff time if they're willing to use the like some small cities, you know, they don't have a big budget. They've got the staff
spirit of this
time to
actually
fit the budget, right?
The spirit of this actually goes the other way, which is
Yeah.
that if they're charging us, we just want
Right,
comfort
right.
that what they're
But
charging is
when I start
reasonable.
hearing maybe creating policy or something,
Don't put a new burden on them.
Opening a Pandora's box.
Yeah, I would agree.
Other questions? So, all those in favor of the recommendation? We'll pause here for 7B and we'll move on to items 4 and 5. And it's my understanding the SANDAG chair has asked that this be placed as a standing item given on the regional plan and the airport subcommittee. And son, welcome. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to all of you. Glad to be here, be back. I'm sorry I was a bit late. So this morning, we traveled about 16 miles west with Mayor Corcoran to give a presentation to the EDC. And we were both late. And we made the statement that somebody needs to do something about that traffic, right? A bit embarrassing, but that's the way it is. 16 miles takes an hour. Glad to be here. I think you already heard by now, we went to our board on the 22nd, and we asked them to delay the regional transportation plan for 2 years, and they unanimously agreed. We arrived at this decision. It was a difficult decision to arrive to from one, the existing plan does not meet the state requirement, which is 19% per capita greenhouse gas emission reduction. We're at 18, but even if we try to get to 19, like the mayor called it squeaking by, is not good enough. Number two, we strongly believe that this offers us an opportunity to truly chart a new vision for this region. And so for that reason, we think we needed to delay the plan to allow us to work on a vision that not only meets the state and federal requirements, but exceed it, and at the same time provide a very clear vision for the region moving forward. I have to be very honest with you. I was very pleased with the unanimous decision, but I'm getting pushback from some of our leaders who say, why are we doing this? We don't need to do this. Let us just do small things. This is going to be expensive. This is going to be difficult. And make it very clear. This is going to be very difficult and very expensive. But as I said before, the cost of not doing it is much more. If we don't do it right now, 10 years from now, the next mayor, the next supervisor, and the next executive director of SANDAG will be saying, oops, we need to do something about that airport, or oops, we need to do something about that traffic congestion. What we're promising you, my team and I, by November, will have a framework of a vision that not only the region needs, but the region deserves. A vision that look at the transportation system, incorporate technology, incorporate the concept of complete carriers, that system that's sustainable, and that provide at least one good option beside the car. At least one. So how do we get San Diegans to take transit? Right now, transit mode split is about 1.5%. The other mode is 98.5%. Now, I'm under no illusion that we're going to get everybody to leave their car as they drive. But if we could give that 1.5% to 5 or 10, we would have created a 50 to 100 year capacity of the system. Yes, sir.
Okay. What are other major metropolitan areas? Which there other major centers?
Los Angeles is about 5, and the work trips, the commute trip is about 7. And as their system gets completed by 2028, I believe they will be in double digit. Obviously, Manhattan is 95% more transit. Boston is very high. Most of the western states are where we are. But
Denver?
yeah, Denver is better. Denver is about 60%. But, you know, regions of our size, they're where we are. Here is the thing about the mode split. Most of our transit riders right now are transit dependent. If we're going to build a transit, we have to make a decision. Is it a transit for transit dependent, or is it a transit for choice rider to have an option for San Diego? I'm taking the latter. We're going to serve the transit dependent, but we're going to serve the choice riders. Our goal is, regardless of where you live in the county, you have a choice as good, if not better, than the car. In a market economy, you can't force people to take a move, but you provide them choices and you price it right. So if I came from Mexico City last night, and I landed on the second runway of San Diego Airport in Tijuana. That's about 23 miles. Not to complicate things, but I would say this is the second runway of San Diego International, because you could have a seamless connection of existing technologies that gets you from one airport to another in 11 minutes. You could check in San Diego and fly from Tijuana and vice versa. The whole point of this is we have not tried to even put on the table for discussion a system that accomplishes that. And so my team and I are doing just that. We have 2 years. By the end of this year, you will see a framework. The second year, you will see some details on the cost-benefit analysis. So I believe the delay of the plan has risks, significant risks. That the region might, for 2 years, lose some federal and state money. And I made it very clear to the board that their decision means that they are deciding to take that risk. Our job as their staff is to make sure we minimize those risks. One is we are going to run a state legislation. Right now there's a spot bill sponsored by Assemblywoman Angelina Gonzalez to make our 2015 Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy valid until we have a new plan that will minimize us losing SB1 or cap-and-pay funding. And on the federal, our team has been in communication with the federal agencies. We're probably going to submit an update to comply with the federal. So we're minimizing those risks, but risk, and I think this is a calculated risk that I think is worth it. I just want you to know, like I wanted the board to know, that this is the time to think big and bold. You know, I'm getting pushback. This is San Diego, we don't finish things here, we do big things here, and that makes me more determined with my team to move forward and put big stuff on the table. So what's that vision look like? Obviously, we're going to tease you a little bit, but you're going to see it in 8 months. This is going to be a transportation network of underground, overground systems, complete corridors. Every corridor should have eventually a dynamic charging, where you could charge your future electric vehicle while you go. Mobility hubs, the smart mobility incorporated into it. Every corridor should have a space for connected vehicle technology that exists today. We're gonna take every freeway and say this lane is for those who have connected vehicle technology. That by itself is gonna double the capacity of the lane. It's gonna go from 2,200 per hour pit lane to about 3,700. Capacity is a function of speed and spacing. You control the spacing of the capacity without pouring any concrete.
Yeah.
These are the ideas we're gonna put forward in the business. I am certain it is gonna, if it's not double, it's gonna close to the capacity of the system as a whole. But is it gonna be cheap? No. Do I know how much it's gonna cost? No. But I know it's a lot of money, in the billions of dollars. Seattle, the people in Seattle just voted $56 billion on the Seattle area to build the transportation system of the future. I don't know what the system will be in San Diego. Is it 56 or is it 40? But it's going to be a lot of money, and it's more than what a half a century now. But the region will have a decision to make. I'm not the decision maker, neither is my team. The decision will be for our elected leaders. They might say, too expensive, too difficult, not ready for it, or they might say, yeah, maybe that's good. And we're not going to build all this system at once. The biggest challenge is how you phase the system, so every time you finish the first phase, it makes sense until you get to the second phase. So that's on the regional transportation plan. The airport is a big part of it. We believe the airport is a very clear example of what a regional project is. Now, where we are today, we are continuing to talk to our partners from the Navy. They have been very accommodating. The last thing I want you to know that the Navy have requested from SANDAC to be a cooperating agency on the NEPA. Not to read too much into that, that's a big deal. We visited with the Navy at the high level with the Mayor Faulkner months ago, and we're going to visit again. The Navy need to make a decision within a month about the spare work. Why spare work? Two things. One is, if you truly want to build a transit that works, you have to have frequent enough services come into the Grand Central, so people could actually, if you miss your train from North County, you don't have to wait an hour for the next one. You wait 5 minutes. To do that, Jim here, who's building the greatest project in the country now, the Mid-Coast, will tell you that if you want to do that, you need to add capacity to the corridor. So the airport, while it is, we talk about the Grand Central, it is much more. It's about having a system that accesses that transit hub. The most important thing in the airport project is not the connector. That's easy. You go underground or above ground, some people move where you do it. The hardest thing is to build a transit hub that it truly is a transit hub, where the existing rail and the future rail is going to come in. To add to that, the greatest economic opportunity this region will see if we do this right is you have about 150 acres, 72 acres for the Spillway Navy, the Old Town, the post office area, about 150 acres. This is as big as another downtown. Housing, affordable and retail, entertainment, there, right there. And you have your biggest employer in the county wanting to locate there. Their request is, give me 1.5 million square foot of office space, and I'll give you the rest. And when I talked to the admiral, I said, you just give us money. I said, you could bulldoze it. I said, okay, give me my need. There's a great economic opportunity that linked to transportation in this case. So people push back and say, why don't we just do the intermodal transportation center? Why don't we just stay at the Santa Fe? If you want to do it right, these are not enough. What if the Navy doesn't pay? We have another location we could do. Premature to talk about it because I don't want to make people nervous. But the point is you have to do it at the scale that is truly possible to have San Diego access the airport with one transfer, and if not better, as good as the top. Where we are right now, we're a cooperating agency with the Navy and the NEPA. We're working our team. We concluded both requests for information on the technology and land use. We were very pleased with the responses on the technology. And next time maybe we'll share it in more detail. We've got 36 responses, 24 companies, and a short RFI. Great ideas. driverless shuttles connecting to airport or a tunnel connecting the terminals to Grand Central. Great ideas. We had the RFI on the land use clause. I haven't seen the result yet, but I expect very positive results too. The Navy got their RFI. At one point when the Navy makes a decision, hopefully this month, we're going to have to figure out whether we enter into agreement with the Navy to move forward. This is not going to be easy. This is not going to be cheap. But this is what this region needs. If you want to attract employers, right now major companies, if you ask Amazon or Apple, say, come to my region, they ask two questions. Do you have transit in addition to car, and do you have housing? That project provides both. You can look Apple and Amazon in line and say, this is exactly. We're also going to count on our state and federal agencies to work with us. The FAA will participate through the airport and funding. The state of California has a lot of money. Right now there is a bill that's run by Senator Bill on some form of redevelopment. That meeting with Senator Bill, he told me, I'd love to use this as an example. So I know we're running out of time, but she's looking at her watch, so I get my signal. I'm going to stop. I'll be happy to take questions. So we can. Yes, sir.
May I ask a question as a citizen? Well, may I ask a question as a citizen, rather than as a member of this committee? I've heard complaints from people in Seattle that the problem with their expanded system is that you can get on a bus in one transit area, but only go to another transit area. And what if you want to go visit a relative? So I've always had two questions. Number one, why are we spending so much on buses that go from one transit area to another, and they're only running at 40, 50% occupancy? My other question is, we have a lot of taxis. Why are they only picking up one party at a time, going from point A to point B? I understand that Uber has a loop where they will pick up several people and then take them to their destinations. Have we considered, is that one of the things that you can
So
be
you
thinking
just
about?
described one of our vision. Our vision is not to have each one running around in an Uber, then we'll create more travel.
Right.
There's the transportation network company and the mobility hub, that's Ray Kramer and his group. All we're going to figure out is, how do we get people to a transit station and from the last transit station to a destination? Not just from one transit to another, to their destination. I believe the technology is there to do just that. But remember, if we're going to have driverless cars and we're going to have the Uber and Lyft, we're going to have more travel if we don't manage it right. And so exactly that, the people in Seattle actually said, okay, we want to change that, and here is $50 million to play with. I do believe this, and by the way, San Diego region is very suited for a great transportation system because of its geography. We have 10 distinct employment centers, some population centers. So you take a population center, say you go to Chula Vista, a lot of people live there. They don't live all in one building, but within 5 mile radius, there's a lot of people living, and you have that transportation network company could bring those people. So if you treat that as a population center, you can connect it exactly to the destination. And finally, I think part of the vision you're going to see is to connect with transit, not the easiest way. So for example, we talk about the purple line potentially going on the 805. Nobody lives on the freeway or works on the freeway. You need to get it to the population center, employment center. Is that harder? Yes. If you do it underground, maybe the right way is an issue. If you do it above ground, it is an issue. But all these things is what's wrong with our transit. Thank you, sir.
Too many questions, not enough time.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, sir.
Ready for 7B?
Ready for part 2.
Okay, great. So Jennifer just provided some information that included certain findings. And some of the findings can just be cured or fixed with the jurisdictions themselves, but other ones, in order to get to that point, they need board approval. And those would be with the transit operators and with the maintenance of effort requirement. So with the transit operators, MTS and NCTD, the ordinance requires that they hold their costs for both bus and rail to CPI, which is used as a measure to help keep their costs reasonable year over year. We also heard that the CPI increased by 5.95% in fiscal year 18, and both exceeded that for rail. Now, the ordinance takes into consideration years in which this occurs and provides a few options that the board can consider. The first is the transit operators may exclude certain unforeseen costs. Secondly, they may use an average over a 3-year period to recalculate, or they can combine the two. So MTS is asking to combine the two, the 3-year average, and exclude certain costs. So they have costs to keep the trolleys in a state of good repair, the required minimum wage increase, and a significant increase in energy costs within rail operations prohibited MTS from achieving compliance with the CPI target. NCTD is asking to exclude certain costs resulting from a one-time staff increase of Sprinter train attendants and staffing for comprehensive maintenance for coaster and Sprinter facilities and equipment. Now, these types of exclusions have been requested in the past and approved by the board. The second requests are related to the maintenance of effort, or the MOE. And in this section of the ordinance, the recipients of local street improvement programs, the street and roads, are required to spend a certain amount of their own discretionary funds towards specific categories of the ordinance on an annual basis. And then if a local agency falls short due to special circumstances, the ordinance allows up to 3 years to make up the shortfall with board approval. The cities of Del Mar and San Marcos fell short, and both are requesting 3 years. The city of Del Mar spent $932 less than required for their specialized transportation services MOE requirement due to reduced activity in the Dial-A-Ride program. And the city of San Marcos had an unexpected delay in a project start date, which caused them to underspend approximately $292,000 toward their street and road MOE requirement. MOE requirement shortfalls have occurred in the past by various cities, and requests such as these have been approved by the board. So we have a recommendation with this item. The ITOC is asked to, 1, consider the Transnet funding eligibility request of the Metropolitan Transit System, North County Transit District, and the cities of Del Mar and San Marcos, detailed in attachment 1. And 2, make a recommendation to the Board of Directors acting as the San Diego County Regional Transportation Commission regarding these requests. So we have representatives from MTS, NCTD, and the cities of Del Mar and San Marcos here, and we're all available for any questions. This concludes my report.
I guess I mean, I don't have an issue with any of the requests particularly, but I guess I feel compelled to comment on, it seems like, like the Del Mar for a $932 item, I guess technically it's required, but we've spent, by the time you get this to the board, you've spent 10 times that in people's labor. And it seems disappointing to me that there's not a way to avoid that.
I actually have the same general line of thought. Is there no way around it based on the way the ordinance is written?
No, it does require commissioner approval to cure that. Yeah, so in order to make a change, it would be going through the process of proposing a change to the ordinance.
Rounded different somewhere.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this has been done in the past. It seems to me last year we had similar circumstances with MTS.
So yeah, last year was MTS. Yes.
Not the same reasons though. I think if I recall
some
correctly.
of them were similar.
Energy was part of it last year too.
Yeah, there was a state of good repair last year.
Yeah, sure.
But the others, like the staff increases, the wage increases, those have come in past years as well.
So, just out of curiosity, a fix for the city of Del Mar, for example, they just need to spend another $932 on something?
It would have to be for that purpose. Right.
Anybody have any other questions or comments, or?
I have no desire to have these organizations, these agencies, not continue receiving their annually apportioned revenue. So I'll make a motion that we approve those recommendations.
Any other questions or comments, or?
Well, let's take the vote, and then I have just a quick question, please.
Okay.
Well, yeah, maybe before we vote, I know, again, the energy cost was an issue that I had last year also. I guess there are two aspects to energy costs, right? One is the price per unit, the other is sort of the volume of usage. I'm wondering if the agencies could, if they haven't already, spoken to their efforts to minimize energy usage, so that we're, particularly if on an ongoing basis we're asked to exclude these increases, that it really be focused on cost per unit issues over which they have no control, whereas there is arguably some degree of control, or at least effort to be as energy efficient as possible. Does that make sense?
Hi, thank you. Larry Marinisi from the Metropolitan Transit System. Last year we did have about $700,000 more in energy costs than we did in the previous fiscal year. It's really made up of two categories. The actual commodity, which was about half of the total cost increase, and the other half was demand and transmission costs, of which we have no control over. Those are SDG&E costs that are specifically transferred to us for those demand and transmission costs. In terms of mitigating some of the commodity costs, these are energy costs directly attributable to the movement of the sending trucks. So it's the traction power to move trains throughout the region. And the cost increases are primarily due to the rate in which we are charged over and above the CPI threshold that requires the CPI number. So it's really a rateable charge that we can't necessarily avoid, even though we get those commodities from a direct access from the state of California. The rates just went up greater than CPI did.
Right, so I guess I get the rate part, and are you also saying that if you increase miles traveled because the fare box collection doesn't cover the actual operating costs, the more miles traveled, the worse this gets? Is that sort of
that would be
answer?
true, yes, but in fiscal year 18 that wasn't the case. Miles traveled year over year was relatively consistent.
Okay.
The cost increases were a rateable amount.
Got it. Okay, so the vast preponderance of the increase really is the rate, and it's not an issue of the usage.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Still any question after?
I'll ask it after.
Okay. No other questions? We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Unanimous?
My question, please. On your cover sheet, under fiscal impact, I'll read this. Upon approval of these requests, etc., the findings will be removed from the audit and basically removed. But why are we doing that? Why don't we include the recommendations and the responses of the member agencies in the audit report, if I understand what this says, so that we will have them to look back at next year to see if they're continuing these issues? Does my question make sense?
Well, there wouldn't be a finding anymore if the board approves the recalculation for the transit operators at least, right? Because now they would be below CPI, so it would go away. I mean, we always have the drafts that do include the finding,
but the final should be the final position for the audit. I mean, has there ever been, are you familiar with that, where you would keep a finding that's been heard?
Speaking purely as a layman, putting aside the technical accounting requirements,
Yes.
I hear what John says. It strikes me that one would perhaps want to see like a footnote saying that this was not an actual finding of an exception, but it was pursuant to a accommodation voted by the committee.
It's going to be a thick audit anyway. Why not make it a little bit thicker?
Your annual report does state it that way. It does,
Okay.
it does state it that way, but we can also,
If you are happy with it, this isn't a motion, it's just a question, an observation. Okay, consider it.
Yeah, it could possibly be included in the procedure, the specific procedure to say that, you know, initially, here's where it was, and then the board approved, and
Yes.
here's where we ended up.
Something, so for future reference, that's all.
You want a document.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Thank you. That's my only comment.
This is the game here for us.
We're going to say, for
All
Brian's
new
item, let's put it for item 8.
All right, so let's move straight into that. It's the triennial performance audit, transit operator funding and eligibility.
All right, good morning. Brian Lane, transit planner here with Sandag, and was tasked to work on this audit recommendation that came before us out of the last triennial audit. So this is tying in nicely with the last item, talking about the exceptions needed by MTS and NCTD in particular. So you don't have to read all of that, and it was attached to, or in the link to your item, but the idea was from the audit, work with the operators to try and look for ways we could amend the ordinance section 4C5 that ties the CPI to their operating cost per hour or operating cost per mile. Looking for ways to maybe potentially avoid coming back here for exceptions that really are just ones that we think, with the amendments that everyone would like, and we still have taxpayer accountability over them. So the audit recommendation, it says collaborate with the operators. So we met with the CFOs from both agencies. I have you and Larry from MTS and NCTD here. We met with Lisa and Ariana to discuss what are some ideas that we could present to you for potential amendments to the section 4C5. So we just have a few ideas, and I'll present some of those. We can discuss those individually with you. We'll go back with what we hear from you and try to formulate some actual language that we would amend in that one section. And then we'll bring that back to you and the board either later this spring or this summer. So we're just hoping to get some ideas from you today to then move forward with actual language that you guys would probably be happy with. Flip through. So here's just a history of the CPI changes as shown in the attachment 1 of the agenda on page 46 on your iPads. You can just see over the years the CPI itself that we use for this has varied. Some years it's positive and it's high. Some years it was actually very low. And so, generally the transit operators aren't going to, staffing costs is one of their biggest drivers of the agencies. They're not going to do wage cuts to try and meet CPI. So having those decreases in some years has been a problem of theirs as well. So I'll go through some of the proposed changes that we've talked about. Some of these these two were actually, they're in the ordinance itself, but do require that we come to the commission and you for the actual recommendation to allow those exceptions. So the first one, and it's part of the audit recommendation, is just completely remove energy costs and use the core CPI that has energy costs removed from its calculation. And then the second one is exclude any federal or state mandates that the transit agencies have no control over, things like minimum wage and zero emission bus mandates. So I guess thoughts on these two that are already in the ordinance. do these make sense, and do we allow these to be those exclusions that are in the ordinance but don't require, these are exclusions that could be taken off immediately and don't require the board's approval. Do these make sense?
Personally, the remove energy costs, personally, your
Well,
question, does that
I was going to say, it's just
incentivize?
Yeah, the only thing about the removing energy costs is, I don't know, just kind of in theory, it seems to take the concept of energy efficiency out of the equation. But recognizing that the unit cost sort of is something that you don't have control over, I don't know. So I don't know if that's how it strikes you as well, but that's.
I just want to make sure that it would keep the incentive to reduce energy by the agencies. Just have it disappear. I don't know if it does or doesn't, or.
Yeah, and this is not being overly cynical in terms of you guys not being mindful of being energy efficient. By the way, it makes one wonder if it just would kind of reads wrong, in a sense.
Yeah, if I make a point, we look at energy all the time in terms of different types of tools we can get in to minimize, to buy it in larger quantities. We looked at, I mentioned earlier the fact that we're getting our commodity from the state of California versus SDG&E, which would have really doubled our actual commodity costs in aggregate for the agency if we hadn't gone that route. We're always looking at it in terms of, we have a budget every year, which is driven by fares, sales taxes. So we're very mindful of energy costs in total as an agency. So it's always on our mind. We're always looking at areas to minimize costs in that category. I think what we're trying to get here is there are areas in which, for instance, we had rates that were just uncontrollable, outside of our control, that we're trying to explain every year. And so we're thinking if we removed the energy costs from the calculation and went to a CPI calculation that really takes energy out of the equation, so you can look at how we're doing as a core agency, how we're fundamentally doing in terms of controlling costs, this would be an option for us to do so.
Again, it just I understand the logic completely. It just strikes me that I don't know. So the casual observer would think that having something that, in some teeny tiny way, enforces energy efficiency discipline is kind of a good thing. The other thing too is, it strikes me that you take out energy costs, you're taking out proposed taking out control over minimum wage plus labor costs. It starts sort of just chopping away. So what's the point of having this in there in the first place if we're taking out labor cost increase and we're taking out energy cost increase? It's almost like, well, what are we really left with? But I don't have as much of a problem with point 2 as, again, it's the first one. I don't know, it just feels like it sort of reads a little bit wrong, or feels a little bit wrong. I don't know if I'm being too politically correct on that, but.
I have a question. So if you don't get this, what are the ramifications?
So we thought
it's not right because it is.
Well, then they have to just keep coming back every year.
it depends. Some there's 6 proposals, and some of these you could take some or all or none. We haven't done a full analysis of if we do a couple of these, is that enough to cure the problem or not? We're really just looking for the ones that I think make sense to exclude, and kind of hearing fuel, energy maybe makes sense, but then if we're not looking at energy efficiency, then maybe it doesn't make sense. So this is one that we need to rethink.
You want to go through all the other proposals and maybe you come back and have a discussion? Okay.
And then with the second one, with like minimum wage, we're not proposing excluding labor costs at all. It's just if the state mandate comes down, and there's a big jump in a certain year, that would be excluded.
Just out of curiosity, do you have a sort of an ballpark what percentage of employees are at minimum wage?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but we had, with our security contract, there was a provision that many of the individuals within our security areas were impacted, not only from minimum wage, but the resulting effect of that, and the progression had to be adjusted relative to the minimum wage. So I want to say that was about $500,000 impact for us. And minimum wage is going from $10 to $15 over the course of 5 years, which is 50% increase in costs, and that's going to have an impact on other employees as well.
The situation for us, for ICTV, is we contract the operations for our bus and for our rail service to third parties, the private industry. So for us, we have provisions in our contract that there's an escalation that's based on core CPI. So for the most part, we are more affected also by using energy CPI. Energy CPI is much more volatile. There's been years right after the recession when it actually came down. So it was in the negative, but yet we had to renew our contracts based on a core CPI, which is more than 2%, and that's about 65% of our cost. So we have an inverse situation in the sense that we're much more affected by using energy CPI when a 65% of our cost is subject to a core CPI.
Continue on the recommendations.
So right now, we usually use these excuses every year. So what you're saying is make these changes so they don't have to come up for future requests.
You'll never have to come back for an exception, right?
I think you'll still see exception requests, but maybe it just wouldn't be as many.
So third one, and I've called this easy fix, but this was one of the auditor recommendations as well, is to stop analyzing bus and rail separately and just put them in as one. So MTS would just have their MTS's number and NCD would have just their number. Any questions on that one? We'd have to rethink. Bus generally is analyzed as a cost per hour. Rail is usually a cost per mile. So we'd have to figure out exactly how that would work. Some sort of a combination. Trolley can be analyzed as a cost per hour. It's possible. You just have to do some conversions to get from mile to hour. It's just generally that's how it works. So that's something we rethink as well. And then the last few, these start getting out of my comfort zone as a transit planner and into the zone of finance folks. But excluding items requiring an actuarial analysis and items that result in volatile fluctuation of costs, such as those related to pension, workers' comp, other post-employment benefits, general liability, etc.
We came, I believe, last year or the year before relative to GASB 68, which is an actuarial analysis that now, it used to be in the notes of the financial statement, now it needs to be on the balance sheet. We have GASB 72 that's coming down, which is other post-employment benefits, which again is going to take information and put it on our balance sheet, which is going to have an impact on our income statements. So those are non-cash transactions that do have impacts on our financial statements, which is a resulting factor with our measuring against CPI. So that kind of talks to that top one.
We did talk about the pension impact last year. I think there was unanimous view that was something that was easy to also exclude. And I thought we actually had agreed that we should exclude that non-cash items in general going forward. I thought we'd proposed that change last year.
We don't have board policy that states that was just, yeah. And I think it's really the first year is where you see the biggest impact, right? It's when you bring on all of those new liabilities that it really has a negative impact. So maybe in the first year that you implement the OPEB. But in terms of the other non-cash items, those are truly a real cost of doing business. It's really saying that you're recognizing some of the expense that you're incurring in that current period, basically setting aside money to pay for those future claims that are coming out of workers' comp. So I'm not sure I would be comfortable with saying take away all actuarially required accruals when
Yeah.
you're trying to look at your costs.
Now, I hear what you're saying. What are, you know, we're looking to an actuary to determine what's the viability of those specific claims actually becoming a cash transaction. Some do, some don't. We would be more comfortable looking at those on a cash basis and being compared to CPI based upon those. And while it will fluctuate on a year-to-year basis, that's one of the reasons why we're looking to have these moved from a non-cash position to a cash position.
I think if you have a large settlement in a year, $10 million versus $1 million, you're going to have the same fluctuation. You're going to come back and ask to have that removed as well, right?
Yeah, I think the only thing is we have insurance that covers up to a certain tier, so we don't have high volatility in some of those types of transactions. So I totally hear what you're saying. I think we can.
And I would say that, and then bringing those liabilities is not just a one-time. For example, this year, the pension liability that we have on our financials is based on the actual valuation that's paid by CalPERS. And the CalPERS board decides what's the discount rate that's going to be used to calculate the pension liability. So this year, actually, CalPERS board decided to reduce the discount rate by 0.5 percentage point. It had a non-cash effect on our liability of $5 million. Non-cash. We've had the pension on books for quite a while, and we're looking for $2 million next year, non-cash, to put us on par to that change in the discount rate. So it will happen not just when we bring those liabilities the first time, it will happen any time that the CalPERS board decides they want to reduce the discount rate. And if they're looking, on an annual basis, and obviously if the long term, if the market does not perform based on expectation, we could possibly see that rate being reduced even further. And for us, just a 0.5 percentage point in discount rate represents $10 million more in the liability. So it's non-cash. Eventually, we have to pay it through our unfunded accrued liability payments. But when that truly happens, it's at once. That's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about non-cash.
Can I just add to the discussion? From an accounting standpoint, the accounting standards are a very rigid set of rules set by a standard setting body, and we're using that to measure this. So anytime we're taking an exception to a very well-defined set of standards and saying we're going to not include this or not include that, it becomes next to impossible for us as your auditors to be able to verify it in the future, because there are no set of standards for which to verify it. It gets into a bit of a rabbit hole, and it would make our job extremely difficult to have more than one or two exceptions. The pension issue is very complex, of course, but those variations, they do, over a period of time, balance out to zero, essentially, kind of ups and downs in between years. So when I saw this recommendation, it makes me cringe a little bit, because we're talking about setting up kind of a new set of standards to define what an expense is for purposes of this calculation, which makes my life very challenging and very challenging to calculate, very challenging for you to evaluate each year.
Tracy, we're all looking at you.
Yeah.
Tracy,
Wait,
come on.
Tracy.
Well,
It sounds like the top one is not recommended.
yeah. But you're not just speaking to the top, you're talking about the package of these exceptions.
The least amount of exceptions there are, the easier it is to verify.
So the top two. The third one is just setting a different percentage than CPI.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, the third one, I just don't have any ability to even begin to say what should be the right number, at least for me.
I think the issue with where that's come up in the past is is there some times where CPI has been negative, but when they sign long-term labor contracts, you never have, there's always some modest, increase, and they try to negotiate that over time. So is it, while CPI may be negative, is it expected that their costs would be negative, they'd be cutting costs at the time, which is not always the case?
And
it's not long-term energy or labor or other contracts.
It's not just labor, it's other contracts, for NCTV and we as well. We have purchase transportation contracts, so large institutions help transportation services. Millions of dollars of contracts that have escalators that are, anywhere from 2.5, 3.5 to maybe even 4%. So that's the thought of, when we get to those years, and you saw on the graph where we have negative CPI, that there's a minimum threshold that we have.
Jennifer, I respect your comments very much. We've seen allowed changes that are being proposed to made permanent, and now we're seeing proposed changes. Are there any of these proposed and allowed changes that you have no objections to? For example, removing fuel energy costs from both the CPI and the calculations, something that we always been accepting.
I don't presume to know the history of even how we got to this point of measuring it by CPI. The easiest thing for me is just would be the last one. Make it something else, or make it CPI can change, as we saw in the graph. Make it 5-year average, or some other thing that would be not have such big highs and lows, or just set 5% or some sort of reasonable
5-year average, or set a minimum threshold allowance,
right.
Something like that would be acceptable.
Seems like the easiest, although I don't know the history of how CPI got selected in the first place.
Does that mean you just put everything back into the sink and then come up with a percentage? Is that what you're what you're basically saying? So you'll have no exceptions, and then if I'm asking, you're recommending you have a set a minimum threshold allowance. So what I'm saying is, the question I'm asking is, okay, if you do that, where's the line? Where's the line that you're starting from? As Jennifer was saying, what's in it? Are you putting everything back in? Are you going to have energy costs or everything in there, or is it just going to be when you're going to start out very low? And
I wonder if at some point, for example, when we're using the 3-year average, we're using those negatives and those positives to come to an average. We would like that negative at least to always be 0. So otherwise, you could have a -2.55, and then you have the average is 2, but we're saying no, that -2 is really 0. That's kind of what we were looking at, making that baseline always be at least 0 or more, but never negative.
And I don't think the intent was ever to take away the exceptions, that where if there is an extreme case of something that happened in a particular year that we need to push us over whatever the threshold ends up being, that we have a mechanism to come to you and explain why those circumstances took place, so that we could recommend a breaks.
I do understand what Jennifer was saying. With all respect to you folks, I know how difficult this is, but these proposed changes, the numbers 1 and 2, look to me like a manipulator's heaven, so to speak, in that you can play with it and make it work every year.
Certainly not the intent.
Okay.
I would say that number 1, from an audit standpoint, coming from an audit background, I was an auditor for 9 years. Non-cash transactions are pretty easy to audit. You can always relate the gas CCA adjustment to the valuation report and the statement of cash flows. And for that, when Jennifer said that over time it's going to level out, yes, but it's not going to level out in 3 years or year over year. It's going to take 10, 20 years. So we just kind of wanted to put it in the mix and clarify Jennifer's standpoint. When she meant level over time, it takes a long period of time for that pension liability to eventually level out. So I just don't see the difficulty in auditing non-cash items. You can always look at the
liability activity, statement of cash flows, actuarial valuation reports.
I guess, well, a couple of points. One is maybe the level of complexity of this is such that we should consider having a subcommittee spend more time on it and come back with a recommendation. Because, you know, I feel like probably at this point everybody's getting a little wary of the time we're spending on this. So is that, from a procedural standpoint, is that something that makes sense?
A great next step. Absolutely.
All right, then I propose that we defer further conversation and create a subcommittee to spend the time that's appropriate for something that gets as complex as this.
Tracy gets the head.
Subcommittee at what level talking about?
Well, subcommittee of the ITAC to.
I would second that.
So, would you like to go ahead and appoint members today?
Do we know when Dick's coming back?
Or we could put an item on your next agenda and you can take action at that point.
Vote for Dick.
Doesn't matter what the next agenda, but it seems.
Yeah, do we actually, I mean, from a governance standpoint, do we actually need to make this an agenda for a future meeting? Can we actually make that decision today?
You could make the decision
From a
today. You could
governance
provide direction and say that you'd like, you know, certain ITAC members on the subcommittee. You could do that.
But we'd actually couldn't formally do this until next committee meeting.
No,
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, I think you can just give us direction that
Right.
you reach out to the ITAC members and try to get one or two of you guys to sit down. If you don't want to waste a whole, I mean, I wouldn't waste a month.
Right.
Get some formal action on the subcommittee to that,
Right.
sit down. I mean, you're looking just for.
Well, I'd be happy to participate. You know, I think Dick would be a great member, no disrespect to anybody else. I don't know if Tracy has the ability to participate, because she could be very important as well.
I think that's a good committee.
I agree.
It's a great committee.
Okay.
It's a great committee.
All right. We can do that.
Thank you guys, appreciate it.
Thank you. Very complicated. It's a tough one. Very. So
We'll still have one more.
All right.
If I have one, it's like, well, depending, but I have 45
Move on to item number 9, which is the ITAC annual report. Ariana, at our first subcommittee meeting earlier this month.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. So we just wanted to fill in the rest of the committee members that your annual report subcommittee for the 2019 annual report met earlier this month. Brad Barnum is chairing that subcommittee. We have Greg Sadowski and we have Kristen Fuller, our chair. As part of that, we have a consultant who is helping us out this year to write the report and bring in some new ideas of how to put that together. Based on the discussion, feel free to jump in, those of you that were there. It looks like the previous format is something that everyone is open to using this time around as well. With the letter from the chairman on the front page, kind of highlighting what is Transnet, what it does, what it accomplishes, highlighting the accomplishments, acknowledging some the challenges, but the future opportunities going forward as well. And then leading straight into some of the pictures with the progress on the projects, as we've done in years past. So keeping in mind that that's probably what the audience, which is the public primarily, would probably be most interested in. One idea that came out of the subcommittee was to this year pull out 3 profile projects and kind of have a larger focus on that up front. And the ideas so far are that the Mid-Coast, North Coast Corridor, and South Bay BRT would be those projects that would be highlighted, but we would also have a couple pages dedicated to other projects throughout the region and covering different modes as well. Some of the other items that were discussed was just to acknowledge some of the discussions that are happening currently and that have been happening this fiscal year. So your regional plan, which you've just heard about, our executive director talking about, the Transplant program update, which you'll hear about next, your annual fiscal audit, and this year, even though you don't have a performance audit, just providing an update on that as well, and the progress that we're making toward addressing those recommendations. In prior years, you've also had a special note. One year you had a special note of the forecast. This year it could be something along the lines of, kind of this idea of the pivotal change. I think that was kind of how one of our members had brought it up, and maybe having a special note about that in your annual report this year. And the ITALC activities and some of the other information would be more toward the back, but we would still use some of these charts that we've had in the past. Pie chart that shows, programming of your Transnet funds, and other charts. So, a lot of visuals. So, trying to use more visuals. So, if anybody has any other thoughts, we'd love to have those. The next step would be in April to bring some draft concepts, and they truly would be draft bullets, kind of with some more of the text and placeholders, kind of, you've seen that in years past, so.
That accurately sums it up from our reflection. Great.
Yeah. We really appreciate staff helping. You guys really helped us out. So much appreciate it.
Appreciate you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think everything you covered and what you guys are doing is great. I guess my only comment, it's ahead of us having the detailed content, but it's on some of the newer initiatives, the regional plan and the bigger picture vision and stuff. I think it just is important if we're going to put stuff in the Transnet newsletter, is what's the tie to Transnet. I think we need to have some nexus to that. It's interesting, things that are going on and things but if this is our report to the public on oversight of Transnet, there's some, how that might be next, even if it's to, future funding needs or something, maybe related to Transnet, similar to Transnet or something. But I think there needs to be some kind of tie, I guess, versus just like a news article. Right. I'm not saying that's what it would be.
Yes. Yeah, and some of the comments I think that we got from some of the members were that we may not know exactly what this will ultimately look like,
and that's
but
part of why I have that caution. Yeah, okay.
Along the same lines, I was going to say that it seems to me that if there's like a single headline that should be communicated to people, it's to not shy away from the revised forecast, which has a fairly significant shortfall in the funding outlook, which will necessitate, review of projects and priorities and what the plan is for that. Not in an alarmist way, but just in a factual communication, because of all the things that have transpired as it relates to Transnet, the great progress on the Mid-Coast line is certainly one and deserves a lot of recognition, but I don't think we should shy away from the not as pleasant reality of the funding shortfall.
I think that was put the good, the bad, and even the in there. I think that was part of our conversation too. And make it very transparent.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So we will work with the consultant and Irene, and we will work toward bringing you something next month.
Just a quick confirmation. Thank you, Ariana. Just a quick confirmation. I think we're going to lose Kai by 11:45 if we're not done. 4 of us still. Okay. On to item number 10, the Transit Program Update. The big boys.
All right, so just quickly, in the interest of time, since we still have a number of items to go, this was a presentation that we provided to the board back February 22nd, and this was part of our annual effort to bring an update to the, especially the major corridors program that's part of Transplant. So I think some of you may recall this slide that we've presented before. We just wanted to provide some context in terms of where does the Transplant plan of finance fit as it relates to some of the other documents that the board approves and that sometimes we bring to you for your review and approval. Regional plan, this is the long-term vision, goes all the way to 2050. It includes all major projects in the region, not just Sandex, but the local agencies, Caltrans and transit agencies and so forth. And Hassan provided an update on when we're going to be updating that. Implementing the regional plan, the first 5 years of the regional plan is the RTIP, and so that essentially identifies specific dollars and specific revenue sources to specific projects. And so this is the implementation of the regional plan over the first 5 years. It includes Transplant projects, but again, it includes projects from other agencies. Next down is the annual program budget. So this is Sandag's budget, and it includes all of the projects that Sandag is working on. Our capital program is mainly Transplant projects, but it also includes some other projects that we do on behalf of the transit agencies. And then lastly, it's the Transplant plan of finance. So this is the sort of the subset that looks at the Transplant major corridors specifically, and it looks at it from both a short-term perspective, the next 5 to 7 years, as well as long-term, sort of the remainder of the years. Again, so the Transplant plan of finance focuses on the bucket that receives 38% of the net revenues, and that's referred to as the major corridors program. And this is the one that includes like your trolleys and freeway expansion, things like that. Okay, so the plan of finance includes a number of assumptions. We assess the financial capacity over the short term, the next 5 years or so, and then the long term, the remaining years beyond that 5 to 7 year period. In terms of revenue assumptions, the first 5 years essentially it should mirror what's in the RTIP, because these are the committed funds that are programmed on specific projects. And then on the longer term, we try to mirror what's in the regional transportation plan, unless there have been updates to the different assumptions. Maybe there's a new fund source, or maybe Ray has updated the Transplant forecast, things like that. So we try to keep it as up to date as possible. And then on the cost assumptions, for the short term, we look at what's in our budget, because that is our latest estimate for what the projects are going to cost. And then in the long term, we use the estimates that are included in the regional plan. And then as time goes on, because it's updated every 4 years, we try to escalate those regional plan estimates just to keep up with inflation. So at this time, we're doing the plan of finance sort of in the context of the 10-year review. So you may recall that last year the auditor came in and said that we had, I think at that time it was 33% of the projects were completed with the South Bay BRT that just opened in January. That has now gone up to 35% completed. So that was looking back. What have we accomplished? How many projects have been completed? Looking forward, is the opportunity to reevaluate the portfolio of projects. As Stuart, you mentioned, sort of in the context of the regional plan. Obviously, that will be happening. What are the projects that remain, and how do they address the mobility needs of the region?
And just to refresh my memory, the percentages that we're using here, that the dollar value of projects as opposed to the number of projects, is the actual number of projects? Okay, thanks.
And so in order to kind of looking forward, so that's sort of the long term, or the review that's being done as part of the regional plan. But in the short term, the next 5 years, there's about $300 million that are available to begin the next set of projects. And so as the board develops its vision of what projects that we'll be working on. These are the dollars that would be available, and this is a mix of Transnet as well as state and federal formula funds that would help them complete the next phase of work in order to develop that vision.
Are formula funds matching funds?
They can be matching funds, yes. Okay, so with that, let me just turn it over to Ray to talk a little bit about the Transnet revenue forecast.
So one of the things that we wanted to explain to the board, good morning, by the way, I haven't been here in a while, it's nice to be back to the iTalk. What we wanted to explain is the confusion that sometimes happens when we talk about dollars and how we measure dollars. Sometimes we're talking about current dollars, which are also known as nominal dollars, which are the dollars that are the year of collection. So it's the dollars that we spend today. And Jose in the plan of finance uses year of expenditure, which is also a similar concept. And so what they all have in common is none of those are adjusted for inflation. So those are just the actual dollars that we spend. But there's another concept when we want to try to compare two things together, which are called constant dollars or real dollars, and those are the ones that we adjust for inflation. So sometimes you'll hear that as $2002 or $2018. And so there's a lot of numbers that are thrown out as it relates to the forecast. And usually when people are comparing two things, at least what I hear many times, is that they're taking dollar amounts that have two different bases and they're trying to compare them. And so that causes a lot of confusion. So one of the things we want to do is just kind of explain where we are at with these two different concepts. So this graph shows the annual collections that we have in year of collection dollars. So it's the actual dollars that we get back from the state of California. It's in year of collection. You can see that in 2018 we had our highest collection ever. This year we're expected to collect almost $300 million. The little table up there shows how close we were in our forecast that we had done. So we were off by 1.2%. We were too high with our forecast in 2017, and we were too low with our forecast by 0.8%. So we're roughly within 1% when it comes to our forecast. That was the kind of the takeaway point from this slide. What this slide shows is that it's not that simple to be forecasting this, because what we're trying to do is to forecast through this percent change that's going on. And you can see that each year we have completely different percent changes. And in fact, since 1991, I don't think it's ever actually been the average over that course. It's been either higher or lower. And so what you'll see here is that there are times where we collected fewer dollars, and again, this is in nominal dollars, so these are the ones that are unadjusted for inflation. You'll see that the pink bars represent the recessions. When we go into a recession, typically people spend less on retail sales, and so you'll see collections drop. And then as you come out of a recession, what you'll see is that there's usually kind of a spike in spending. There's a pent-up demand for certain things. People start spending again, and so our collections go up. And so you can see by as much as 10% or down by 9.2%. So a lot of variation in the collection from year to year. But I'd like to have you take a look here at the last couple of years. Okay, so this is one of the most robust economies that we've had in a long time, the last couple of years. But what you see is that our increase is about 3.3 and 3.5% in terms of revenue. You see that as we came out of the recession, when we had 1% inflation, we actually went up by 8.4% in terms of collection, and we had 1% growth in the economy. So it's an important concept, because when we correct for inflation, these are the dollars that now, in terms of buying power, that's what it's looking like. What's happened is that we have very low increases in terms of buying power, in terms of the revenue that we're getting from the Transnet dollars. And over the life of the two programs, Transit and Transnet 1 and 2, the average increase is 1.02% per year. Okay, so most of the revenue collection is related to population growth too. So we've had faster population growth, and we've actually decreasing revenue growth in the Transnet revenue. When we go back and we take a look at this original forecast that was done, the original forecast for Transit 2 said that we would collect $14 billion. The forecast was created in 2002. At that time, the forecast only actually went out to 2030 or so, out to here. So the rest of this is an extrapolated line. But with that said, you see that when the Transit extension passed, we were on track to collect that amount of money, but because it was passed before Transplant 1 was had finished its term, we didn't actually start collecting revenue till 2009. And you see that by 2009, we'd started to go into the Great Recession, and the collections were actually lower, okay? So had we redone the forecast here, and you just took this line and you moved it down here, you would see that, you know, you'd be probably at $12 billion, right, if you just parallel the line down. So when we looked at, when we had the whole Measure A thing, we also looked back and to see where were we with the original transfer, because we kept working with the $14 billion number. And what we ended up doing is reforecasting based upon historical information and what we knew, what that number would be today. So instead of 14 billion, it looks like it's coming in at about 9.2 billion. There's two big salient points here. One is this forecast that was done in 2002 was using a base of 4.4 million people in terms of population. That was kind of the estimate out to 2050. And in large part because there was no estimate out to 2050. We had to extrapolate out there. The state, nobody was doing forecast out that far, but we were collecting out to 2048. So it looked like we had a population of 4.4. The new estimates from the state look like they're coming in at about 4 million. So if you think about that, that's 400,000 people who are not paying taxes each year. And that's a big part of that. And you see that that's part of the reason that the slope is different on the lines. And then you see the effect of the Great Recession. And we actually, this is in real dollars, right? These are in constant 2002 dollars. You see that our collection in the last 2 years is, even though it's the highest in terms of year collection, you see that in terms of buying power, we're still not back to where we were in 2006, 2007. Okay, so that's a challenge that we're facing with this particular form of revenue. When we take a look at the annual collections now, and forecast out based upon the new inflation rates, and we say in terms of year of collection, how much do we believe that we're going to be able to collect? So these are now the dollars we're correcting for that. The number is 18.8 billion. So this is a number that we put out there, and I think this is the one that's in the plan of finances, the 18.8. Just for reference, and it's only for this slide, we've never used this number, but if we had taken that 14.4 billion and we had instead of doing it in 2002 dollars, we would have done it in year of collection dollars, that number would have been about 29.3 billion. So that's just to give you complete transparency in terms of how to compare these two forecasts. The $18.8 billion forecast, however, you know, there are a lot of assumptions that go into it. And one of them is that is the rate of inflation. And so what we've tried to do on this particular slide is to show the impact of a 1% change in the rate of inflation. So I think we're using about 2.74% inflation right now in the 18.8 billion forecast. And you see a plus minus 1%, how much difference it would make in terms of collection. And this is just that year over year multiplicative force of inflation. So although the latest forecast that we did is 18.8 billion, there's a lot more downward pressure on this number than there is, you know, potential upward pressure. So if you're looking at this, the potential is, sure, it could go up. People could start spending more on taxable retail sales. But in reality, there are a lot of downward pressures. Like, for instance, we see a shift of people who used to purchase goods now purchasing services instead. So an example of that would be, 20, 30 years ago, if you had a neighborhood, 10 people would buy, everyone would have their own gas lawnmower. Remember that? Everyone had their own lawnmower, okay? And you paid sales tax on all of those. Well, it's much more likely now that you're hiring a landscape service, and that guy buys one lawnmower and mows 10 lawns with it. So our sales tax revenue goes down as people move from goods to services. As the population ages, the older population spends less on taxable retail sales and more on services also, and services aren't taxed. So you see downward pressure from that too. So the aging of the population as you go out to 2050 would put downward pressure on this. Another thing is that millennials seem to be much more interested right now in experiences than in actual things like Gucci purses and things that might have sales tax associated with it. They'd rather have an experience. Experiences don't necessarily have, like the Gucci purses that Ariana carries. They don't have sales tax associated with them. And also, if you think about the housing slowdown, when one of the biggest components of sales tax was people, you buy a house and you remodel, you throw out, perfectly good carpeting and refrigerators because they were the wrong color, and you go buy all new stuff and it had sales tax associated with it, right? And that isn't happening as much anymore. So what you see is that like the collection from retail sales, like Home Depots and things, are lower. And in addition to that, we have Amazon, which although we're getting that back now, there's been an erosion in the amount of sales tax that we've been able to collect on retail goods. Yes, sir.
So just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, and by the way, the points that you're making are incorrectly very insightful and important that you're factoring in, but does that mean that, at least for the chart, your reference to the word inflation is not a purely kind of macroeconomic-like inflation, but you're actually talking about spending per person as part of the definition of inflation in this graph?
No, so this one, so there's an actual macroeconomic inflation rate, and we used to use a long-term rate that we looked at, over 30 years what it was, and it's about 3%. So there's an inflation rate that we used when we put it into the plan of finance. So right now it's about 2.74%.
Okay, so then where do these curves reflect the reduced spending per person that you're describing?
Well, they don't right now. Then part of what I'm saying is that when I reforecast this, and there might be some upward pressure too, I don't know, but I'm just saying that there are a lot of forces here that may show that this forecast actually comes in lower than it is right now. Because what we're doing is we're constantly trying to improve our forecast model, and so that we haven't put into it a lot of these lifestyle changes. That's not something that you typically forecast. We typically forecast based upon there was how much income you make, and then there was disposable income, and a percentage of that disposable income would go towards buying goods that were taxed.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, as we're moving forward, we're trying to dial this in even more. And right now, it looks like the sales tax, and this is, when we talk to our consultants, Uni Services down called Avenue, they have the same concerns, is that there's an eroding sales tax base. I mean, there's exceptions every year at the state level of things that are an exception that you don't have to pay sales tax on. There are really nothing that they add that you have to pay sales tax on. So that's something that we need to, that we're trying to monitor here. So that's just a long way of saying that this 18.8, I mean, it will change as we do the updated forecast, and we should have that done in a month or two. And it's likely to come down. I don't think it's going to come down tremendously yet, but if there is anything, there's downward pressure on it. So that kind of covers the revenue side of it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you see anything in there that would make it change, or that you're looking out that far, that would make it go up? Because all you're saying it's going down.
Well, that's where so you have certain things like right now, millennials are living with their parents, right? For instance, okay, and the number of our population in terms of people per household is going up, and a lot of that is because there's no available housing. So let's say that the jurisdictions get together, the RENA program is successful, we build more housing in San Diego, people start to move out from where they have shared living spaces and buy their own houses, you'll see an increase in taxes if there's more spending that happens.
Well, does it have to just be buying a house? Could
No.
it be renting more houses, or
Well,
you're just saying more availability of housing?
It's more, if you had more availability of housing, then what happens is that people spend money on the house that is usually associated with retail sales spending. So you're buying dishes, or you're buying linens, or you're buying carpeting, or this is all taxed. If you're renting, you may not be buying that as frequently, right? So there could be an uptick. I mean, the point is that if household formation goes up, each one of those households has now additional goods or services that they want to purchase, and on the good side, they would be taxed.
I think you could see a generational, so baby boomers were a fairly large generation, Gen X, Gen Y very small, millennials where they are now, what Ray's reflecting is they're buying experiences that are not taxable. But as you see that aging of that generation, will they buy houses, will they do things that other generations have done before them? So you may see an uptick, right, because they have such a large base of size of that generation. The other things that's being talked about at the state level, I mean, they are talking about whether it passes or not, but whether or not sales taxes should be applied to not just goods but services. So to the extent that services like architectural engineering services, you know, getting your hair cut or other things like that are taxed, obviously that would grow. That would, you know, grow the sales tax revenues, but, so there's, right now, there's things that are pushing it down, but.
How is this compared to other states that, you know, these revenues? Have we been compared to Arizona or even Washington or Oregon, you know, in their revenue growth?
Yeah, we haven't looked across other states. We look across other counties within California, is most of what we do, and all of them have very similar patterns. This isn't unique to San Diego. This is something that is specific. The other thing is, if you think about it, there's a larger and larger percentage of people's income that's spent on rent, and rent is not taxable. So if you're spending more money on rent, that's taking money out of your pocket that you could spend on some other good.
A little bit of mortgage isn't taxable either, is it?
Right.
If you're writing a check, it doesn't matter where you live.
So in California, as the cost of housing goes up, people spend more of their money on things that are not taxable, like rent and mortgages, and so they have fewer dollars to spend on taxable goods. And so that's impacting all of California. That's not specific to our county at all. So if that changes, if housing affordability comes down or salaries go up, you could see a shift in the positive direction on this. It's premature, I think, to add anything in or put too much weight on any one of those factors. All I wanted to do was to just put them out on the table in terms of transparency, in terms of what's happening with sales tax revenue, and that it's a weaker source of revenue than 20 years ago when we first thought that this is a good way to fund this for 40 years. So there's some weakness in it.
So if you had to look at it from a layman's standpoint, the more it costs to live in San Diego or California, the less Transnet dollars
yes.
you're going to have.
Yes, you can make that assertion, yes.
Okay, should we move on?
Ominous.
Okay, so revenue's half the equation, cost is the other half of the equation. How much does it cost to do the work? And so here's a chart rather that a lot of you saw when Alan Kossip and I did a similar presentation last year. This is the Caltrans Construction Cost Index. And you can see, this chart starts in 1991, but you can see throughout this period it was it was rising, but it was pretty predictable, pretty uniform. In fact, we have data that takes us all the way back to 1972, and it shows almost the exact same shape of the curve. Even during 2 oil embargoes during the 70s, when everything else seemed to spike, construction costs seemed to stay relatively predictable. 1987, Transnet 1 passed, and 16 years later, 2003, we started looking at the Transnet extension ordinance that created ITOC. And this is the time we were estimating all the projects that are in the Transnet extension, and we also knew that the original Transnet ordinance would not build 3 projects, and those 3 projects became the lockbox, right? Route 76, Route 52, and Midcoast Trolley. So those were put as a lockbox project in the extension. Okay, so that takes us to 2002. 2004, the ordinance passed. Look what happened right after the ordinance passed. Prices, remember, this is when we were budgeting these projects, prices skyrocketed. And so it's interesting because we were having very similar conversations back then that we're having now, which is how are we going to finish the program? Because we have all these jobs and prices have skyrocketed. And so, similar conversations, but then you remember what happened in 2007, 2008, the Great Recessions, and what happened? Prices plummeted. And not only did we stop having those conversations about how we're going to finish all the projects, but our board directed us to, hit the accelerator and produce what's a plan, we call a robust plan of finance. Our buying power had never been greater because not only were costs dropping, but revenues costs plummeted, but revenues did not plummet as much. You couple that with the fact that interest rates were historically low, and we had the most buying power we ever had. And so that took us to here. And so we hit the accelerator. So this graph stops at about 2013. And when we're estimating projects in 2013, we could have gone a number of ways. We could have said, okay, it's 2013, it went up, it went down, and and it doesn't seem to want to go anywhere. There we go. It went up, it went down, and so what would we do? Let's predict this, right? This looks like an extension of this curve. It went up, it went down, so we're good, right? What this line represents, this is a set of graphs that Ray and his economist produced for me last year. And this is the 50% confidence level of looking forward. So you have a 50-50 chance that you're going to nail your costs either just above this line or just below this line. And this is the average. So you have a 50% confidence level. But let's say you just wanted to be a little bit more secure. You wanted a 95% confidence level. If you had 95% confidence level, that's the lower end of the curve. And that's the upper end of the curve. A safe bet, right? You're going to hit it within the 95% confidence level of looking forward. Well, this is what's happened. That's the blue line. So that's what really happened. Prices skyrocketed again, and we're having these same conversations. Now, the good news is you can see up here, things have started to level off a little bit in the past couple of years. At least they're not going up at this rate. But what this really shows is it's not to say that that we have this great ability to predict where it's going to go, but to show you the challenges of trying to predict future construction costs in a very, very volatile market. And that's what we're experiencing right now. With any luck, these things will level off and just become more predictable, because the more predictable they are, the better able we are to accurately match up dollars with projects and this whole idea of the plan of finance. And that's the reason we do the plan of finance almost every year. So with that, I want to hand it back to Jose to finish up.
All right. Okay, so, as part of the plan of excellence, one of the things that we said was, we want to bring more transparency in terms of what the numbers mean. So one of the things that we've tried to do here is, provide ranges for all of the forecasts, whether it's costs or revenues, and the width of the range has to do with the uncertainty associated with that. So what you see here on the right-hand side essentially is the midpoint of that range that we are noting over here on the left. Something else that we've tried to do to make it more visual is just to show, that on the revenues, the darker the green, the more certainty there is associated with those forecasts. And then as it progresses towards the yellow, there's more uncertainty associated with that. So taking those same numbers, but then providing you with a comparison to what we showed about a year and a half ago, October 2017 is when we last presented this. So here are the numbers as we've estimated them right now, and here as they were back then. So the costs, you can see there's been an increase, of what Jim was talking about. This is a pretty significant increase just from one year to the next. We're seeing a 16% increase. Again, the costs that we're reflecting are the costs that were estimated during 2018 as part of the regional plan update, so we've included those. Anticipated debt service, as time goes on, we're paying off debt, so you would expect that to go down. So the grand total to complete all of the projects is $31.2 billion. And that includes $26.7 billion just for project costs, plus the $4.5 billion for debt service. Looking at the revenues, the first row refers to Transnet. So you'll notice that it went down. Essentially, every time that we do a plan of finance, 1 year drops off. So you would expect that the amounts, if the forecast remains the same, you would expect the amounts to go down a little bit. The program grants and so forth, that's this next row. Is a little bit lower than last time, but this is just reflecting what we have in the current RTIP. And then we get into the next two rows 3 and 4. This is anticipated funds from existing sources. So row 3 is the anticipated formula funds. So this is things that you've seen in your RTIP amendments, like RSDP funds, CMAC funds, STIP funds, things like that. When we did the estimate a year ago, we were trying to be conservative because SB1 was just coming in. So now that we've had a cycle of SB1 funds, we've learned some, and so we feel that we were perhaps too conservative, and we've increased the forecast. On the fourth line here, These are, for the most part, SB1 funds, but they are competitive funds. So even though we've gone through a cycle, we feel comfortable about our ability to compete for those funds. Again, these are competitive, so there's no guarantee that we're going to get these. It depends on how other agencies, what kinds of projects they present. If you add all of the revenues from existing revenue sources, you come up with about $21.4 billion. So that's rows 1 through 4. And that leaves about $9.8 billion of additional future revenues that need to be identified in order to fully fund the $31.2 billion program. So what that means in terms of leveraging ratio is that this $6 billion would need to leverage $4.2 for every dollar of Transnet. We would need to leverage 4.2 of other funds in order to fully fund all of that. Last time we were here, the leveraging ratio was only 1 to 3.4. At that time, we thought it was reasonable, maybe a stretch goal. Our historical for the first 30 years was about a 1 to 3 ratio, so we felt the 1 to 3.4 was still achievable. But now that it's 1 to 4.2, we feel that that is probably no longer reasonable to complete. So in terms of how much can the program complete and how much may have to be reevaluated and perhaps completed beyond 2048, which is the horizon of the ordinance. So at least if all of these assumptions hold, and there's no additional revenues, then $9.8 billion worth of projects may need to be completed beyond 2048. But if we have, a leveraging ratio that's closer to the 3.4 or something more historical, then a portion of that $9.8 billion, we should be able to raise those funds. But we won't be able to make the 9.8. So in terms of how much money will be, or how much in worth of projects may need to be pushed out, it could be anywhere from about $5 billion to this $10 billion that's shown on the screen. Sort of the flip side, how much can we complete? So what that means is, yes, there's some dollars that may need to be completed beyond 2048, but there's still about $19 to $22 billion worth of projects that can be completed. So in terms of determining, okay, which projects, and this is just a summary of the numbers that I just went through. As the board that completes the regional plan, they will need to take a look at what remains to be completed. So if you look at sort of the checklist that was done for the 10-year review, these are all the projects that were completed or have been completed from the Transnet program. These are the projects that are in progress. Some of these projects mean in progress maybe 2 lanes of the original 4 lanes that were anticipated have been completed, but lanes 3 and 4 have not yet been completed. Others, like the Midcoast Trolley, is currently under construction, so it's in progress but not yet open to serve for service. And then here's the future projects. These projects have not yet been started. So as the board reevaluates, these projects with other regional projects, which ones still meet the needs, the mobility needs of the region, they may say, some of these projects may need to be done differently, or they may need to be done at a later date, because right now we just don't have the funding for those. So that was our presentation. Any additional questions that you may have, we're open to those questions.
Any ideas on how to get more money?
I appreciate the shadings of risk, if you will, but I'm just curious though, for example, just taking the $6 billion, where in Ray's prior analysis of certainty is the $6 billion itself? Is the $6 billion the sort of the line in the middle, or is it sort of discounted just for in any way for sake of comfort? Is that, you know what I'm asking?
So So we use
because he's already said that there are these forces that, you know, arguably are pushing the number down. So from a forecasting, we've got this as the most certain level of confidence. Where is that $6 billion in the scale of, you know, up plus or minus?
Well, so the $6 billion, the number that we give Jose comes straight from that forecast. They use a point forecast, so it would have been, because of 32 point some odd % of the total, that's $6 billion versus the 18 billion. So
right.
6 of the 18. So when I put the uncertainty on it, I just showed you the impact of inflation. You know, and so one of the things you can look at is if inflation is lower, then that number is going to be lower than $6 billion. If inflation's higher, it could be higher than $6 billion.
Right. Yeah.
Partially working with that too. So you could put plus minus 10% confidence interval on that, and for planning purposes, that I think would be reasonable. So
okay, yeah, I didn't ask the question well. So the $6 billion is the point forecast without any cushion built. Yeah, okay, got it.
And also, just to add to that, the certainty also incorporates the level of control that Sandac has over those funds. So Transnet is the local source, and so the board controls that source, and it's approved by the voters all the way to 2048. The other fund sources, even though they're long established, there's always some risk that Congress or the state may change them.
Thanks.
Two questions. One is a very stupid question. The first general question, you do foresee enough funds to finish those projects that are in progress?
Well, so the projects that are in progress, and just to give you one example, the I-5 express lanes, okay, so this one here, it's in progress in the sense that the transit ordinance originally contemplated adding 4 lanes. Okay, we're in the process of building the first 2 lanes. So the board could decide that yes, they do need to add the 3rd and 4th lanes, or the board could also decide to just complete the 2 lanes and just stop right there.
All right. And the other dumb question, we were at UTC yesterday with all those columns and overheads. Is that the Mid-Coast Trolley Extension?
Yes, and it's in progress because it's under construction, and we don't want to take credit for it until it's open for revenue service.
Okay, and you do have it, it's quite a mess out there.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
But you will be able to finish that.
No, but you've done an amazing job at doing all that with relatively minimum interruption and traffic flow, because I live in that area, I'm there all the time, so it may not look pretty, but it's actually...
It'll be pretty when it's done.
Okay, thank you. So they'll have to cut, okay, I understand, you've answered my question. Who's going to, obviously the board will decide as we go along which projects in progress are cut back, which projects on the future, that are in the future list, you'll have to prioritize that.
Right, so as the board completes, the regional plan vision and kind of reevaluating all of the projects, we'll know more over the next several months, which projects may need to be either rethought about or just redesigned, whatever, as we move forward. Yeah.
I see you have talked about population growth, and you've had projections to 4.0 million and then 4.4 million. If we go to the lower population growth, there may not be the need for the 4 lanes that you're talking about. What is today's population considered in comparison to the 4 to 4.4 you're looking at?
So right now we're at about 3.2 million people.
3.2.
So we're looking at a growth of about 700,000 people over the forecast time period, of which about 500,000, which is about 81%, are going to be age 65 plus.
Will be what?
55. Age 65 plus.
Thank you. All right. Those are all my questions. This is too big an issue for us to make decisions on right now, correct?
Well, I don't think we can ask them to make decisions.
We can make decisions.
I was curious, Jim, in the analysis of the construction costs, your reference to the, I can't remember if you used the word sort of stabilization or something to that effect. Is that determined based on really just kind of looking at the trend line? Or do you or somebody else, here at Sandag, actually look at here's a geographic circle around San Diego, and we look at the volume of similar sorts of construction projects that are using the kind of labor we use, using the kind of materials that we use. So is there like a competitive analysis that provides insight into the future, or is it really the best you can do is just look at the trend line?
Well, looking forward, we
Yeah,
depend on Ray to predict with the plan of finance, both revenue and cost,
So
long term.
Yeah. So we only have historical data when it comes to construction costs. There are a couple of different indexes that we can use. The one that Jim was referring to is the Caltrans Construction Cost Index.
Right.
And so that one takes a look at what it costs to build these major capital projects, and it comes from the bids that they actually receive. So it's a very specific index, if you will, but it's the one that we have to compete against. So when you see LA passing a lot of sales tax measures, and they're absorbing a lot of the construction crews up there, then the bids go up because there's more dollars chasing those construction crews. A lot of this is supply and demand. We have taken a look at the number of bids and what that does to the cost. And so the more bids you have, the lower the cost is. It makes it perfect, makes economic sense. And when Jim talked about when we put the pedal to the metal and we were getting projects at even below cost at some point, it was because we had a lot of competition because most of the construction crews weren't working. Now they are. And a lot of them are going to LA. So you see these spikes in the local construction costs. That's what we're looking at. And so what we do is we're going to reset the line essentially now that we have this new data. In the last couple of years, we've seen that it's started to level out. Okay? If you go back and you look at that graph, you'll see there are little dips right around recessions. There's a big dip around the Great Recession, and now this is up here. So if we go into another recession, you can see that stabilizing, maybe coming down a little bit, but there's still a tremendous amount of demand, just up in LA for construction. And so I don't think that this line is going to come down back the way that it was. And so what we would probably do the next time that we forecast is we'll do some research, but I'm anticipating that whole line is going to shift up, and this is kind of the new norm in terms of construction cost. It'll be a lower slope possibly than we've had the last few years, but it's not going to come down significantly.
And we are absolutely saying that the inflation due to a couple of things. There was a lot of consolidation of the construction industry during the recession. And so when people say, well, is that a San Diego contractor? Well, the medium-sized San Diego contractors were all gobbled up by others or went out of business, like some of the big names you might have heard of. And so that's part of it. There's less competition. And like Ray said, both the public sector is booming right now and the private sector is booming right now. And so costs continue to go up.
Can't wait to see what the new regional plan does to this.
Any further project for future bond measures, or are we sort of off of that subject now? As whatever, the one that was just defeated, do we expect to come back in 2020 or 2024?
Sandag is not working on any sales tax measure. Sandag is not working on any sales tax measure right now. The only agency that is actively pursuing one or considering one is MTS. They're discussing the possibility of going for 2020 ballot. So it's not completely off the table. We don't have active discussions right now.
Tax measures, yes. Thank you.
Thank you guys, appreciate it. Thank you. Move on to item number 11, the draft 2020 Transit Major Corridor and Regional Bikeway Program. Susan, revise the review this.
Hi.
Hello.
Good morning. I'll make it really quick. I'm here today to present the draft fiscal year 2020 annual budget update for the Transit Major Corridor and Regional Bikeway programs. For FY 2020, there are 96 Transnet capital projects in various stages of development, from preliminary engineering all the way through construction and closeout, including 24 bikeway projects. That represents about $8.3 billion, a mix of federal, state, local, and Transnet dollars. A summary table noting the differences between the current approved budget and the proposed budget is attachment 1. You'll note that there are a couple highlights there. The draft budget proposes to add $33 million for the continued implementation of the Habitat Conservation Fund, funding that at $4 million annually for the next 10 years. Another significant budget change is the addition of state SHOP funding for the construction of Sweetwater Bridge improvements at Interstate 805. And we continue to advance the projects in the Regional Bikeway Program. $29 million of Transnet bike funds were added to the draft budget to fully fund the construction phases of a handful of projects. We have 6 projects which are scheduled in the Bikeway Program to advertise for construction next year, 3 which will begin construction, and the Rose Creek portion of the Coastal Rail Trail is expected to open for users in spring 2020. That adds about 20 new bikeway miles to the Regional Bikeway Program. Any questions on that? This is our annual budget update that Jose referenced earlier in his.
I have no questions.
The thing I was looking for is, and maybe I'm not thinking about this correctly, but the reference to the 33 milestones, is that an increase from a previous estimate of the number of milestones that would be accomplished prior to the increase in the budget that you're referencing here?
No, so when we're looking at the annual milestones, that's just for that slice of time. And so it's actually a decrease from what we had anticipated we would deliver in the current fiscal year.
Got it. Okay, so, from my point of view, for whoever who writes these little boxes in these summaries, that context that you just mentioned is important, because otherwise I look at this and I say 33 milestones. I don't know if that was in relation to a prior plan of 5 milestones or a prior plan of 500 milestones, but so it's actually somewhat noteworthy that you're saying it's actually lower than was previously estimated, because if the budget number was going up, I would have thought it was the other way around. So
it's just a matter of where the projects are in their cycle of
yeah.
development, but we can include some sort of context for you.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Susan. We're going to table item 12, put that to the April agenda. Sorry, Brian. And move to item 13, the Specialized Transportation Grant Program Cycle 10, call for projects.
Hi. So I'm going to also keep mine brief. So if you recall, in 2018, I came before I to talk about the Specialized Transportation Grant Program, about the criteria and the goals, and we kind of discussed that about, what do we want to see going forward. And then in July, we actually finalized those evaluation criteria. The board took action and released the call for projects. I'm not going to be going through my slides. They're in front of you. And so the call was released in July. We had about $3.1 million available for Transit Senior Mini Grant. We also have federal funds, which I won't be discussing since they aren't necessarily in the purview of this committee. So $3.1 million available. We received 21 projects asking for about $5 million. So you can see that oversubscription and the demand that's there. And so based on the evaluation criteria and the evaluation process, we're recommending that 10 projects be fully funded and one additional project be partially funded. And those are listed in attachment 1 for your review. And the ITAC is asked to review and discuss the projects with consistency with the eligibility requirements. So all of the projects are staff reviewed and are eligible. They're consistent with the priorities. They are consistent with those that are identified in the coordinated plan. These projects are volunteer driver programs, information referral services, and the like, and I'm happy to answer any questions on any specifically. But that kind of concludes my report.
Thank you for commenting that you've all been reviewed by staff and are eligible. I don't have any questions. Anybody else have any? No. Great. What was the discussion we had about moving or potentially looking at one big organization that provide these services? Is that part of the 10-year review that we discussed?
It's part of the one that you just deferred.
It's a strategic.
That's what I was wondering about it. All right. We'll hear about it next month.
And just to follow up, next steps is we've already shown this to the TC one time for information. We're going on Friday for their recommendation to the Board of Directors, which will bring on their meeting March 22nd. And then senior mini grant, pending those approval, would begin in July, those contracts.
On to item 14A, Mrs. Ariana.
Yep. This is the 10-year review, and so the board conducts this 10-year review. You provide recommendations as part of that process. The ordinance, it's a requirement to look at the entire program comprehensively, and the way that it was conducted this time was to take a look back at performance over the last 10 years and then use the results of that evaluation to inform the future as we move forward with the program. And I will just say that we had 20 action items come out of that 10-year review, and 6 of them have been completed. The remaining 14 are anticipated to be completed as we look to our board to adopt this regional plan. Because remember that the 10-year review was conducted concurrently with the regional plan so that we could streamline those processes, and then also at the same time as our performance audit, which also captures some of the recommendations from this 10-year review in more detail. So we're going to the Transportation Committee with an update this Friday and the board next Friday.
Questions for him? Administrative 14B.
So 14B is the performance audit, your triennial performance audit, which the ITOP conducts every 3 years. This time around there were 26 recommendations in all. There were rankings, so 4 different rankings for all recommendations: critical, high, medium, and low priority based on the recommendations' impact to the Transplant program and the goals and standby responsibilities. To date, 5 of the 26 recommendations have been completed. There's 1 recommendation that is partially completed, and same as a 10-year review, we provide updates to the Transportation Committee and the board and to you on a regular basis as well.
Questions or comments?
I have to be honest and say I didn't get to this in my reading of the package, but I do appreciate that you come back with the update and I'll be more diligent.
Well, we can always, if you have a question or whatever, we're here to help with that.
You strategically snuck it in towards the back of the package.
Yeah. It's a busy agenda. I mean, we're happy to, there's a certain item or something that we'd like to follow up on.
And then last 15.
And then the last one is really just, we wanted to take this opportunity to remind everyone that we currently have, there is a position, which is Jonathan Pinnock's position, which is currently being advertised, and the application period closes next Friday. So we are actively trying to recruit and trying to get some applications in, but we would love it if you could, spread the word, help spread the word.
Do you have any in?
We have 1 prospect, so we know of 1 gentleman that will be submitting, and so
I've heard discussion last night. I submitted it to Company from the Senate. I talked webpage and some different contacts.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. We appreciate that. Okay.
With that, our next meeting is Wednesday, April 10th.
I just have a question. And I don't know if it's a camera, but you know, I always appreciate that there are a lot of people at all of the different entities who make a lot of time to not only prepare materials, but actually come here. I'm curious whether Sandag has looked into the concept of creating video conference capability so that people wouldn't be spending as much time traveling back and forth to get here, and they could do presentations through video conference. I don't know, you know, maybe there are lots of other reasons why it's a good thing for people to be coming here, but you know, they're just over the course of time, there are lots of people who I'm sure are spending a lot of time, if you add it all up, just coming back and forth, so.
I think it's something that we can bring up at, you know, with some of the folks internally that will know more about this than I do. We have to be mindful of around that.
I mean, we have,
Yes.
we had some video conferencing capability in one of our conference rooms, it's a smaller one. But I mean, we can check with our admin folks and where, I think, you know, if we pursue future office space, that was something that was in the discussions and stuff. But we can check with our admin.
Because especially in some cases, somebody's sitting there waiting through the whole meeting and then they come and, God, sometimes we don't have any questions and they just have to go home, but just a thought. Is that actually a Brown Act issue, or do you just have
I was thinking more along the lines of ITAC members participating.
No, I'm solely
But if
thinking
it's
of,
a presenter, no, I don't think it would be.
you know, if there's like the city of Carlsbad,
Yeah,
or, you
that
know.
makes so much sense.
We'll check with our
Yeah.
admin and those folks. Okay.
That is the adjournment.
You don't need a motion.
We are adjourned.
You're the
Thanks,
boss.
everybody.
So then when would be your last meeting?
I think it's, let's see.
I know, I don't know what happened. It's one of those things.